The next presentation will deal with the results of our brand growth study and will be presented by Jori van de Spijker. Jori van de Spijker is not only Best Researcher of the Year, but also Global Commercial Director of DVJ. So I think the best person to share the insights from this year's brand growth study. Jori, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Lucas, and welcome back, everyone. Looking forward to share the results of this year's brand growth study with you all, which focuses on the moment of truth. So for me, that is now, of course, when I can finally present the key insights that we got from our yearly study. But before I get into that, I want to briefly reflect on, again, why we do that. And Lucas already touched upon it in his introduction. But for us, the brand growth platform is something that started many years ago with the introduction of the How Brands Grow handbook from the Ehrenberg Bass Institute, which I think changed the marketing landscape for everyone, or for a lot of marketeers across Europe and across the world. And we were also very inspired by that book, not only because of the findings in the book, because we believe there's also a lot of other interesting academic findings in there, but more importantly, we were triggered by the thought that you can approach marketing and brand growth from a more scientific perspective, looking at laws and patterns to really understand what works and what doesn't work. And we wanted to contribute to that as an organization by also helping brands grow. And that's something that materialized in our brand growth platform. So over the years, that has developed into partnerships that we now have with the academic world. We have our own series of universities that we closely work with. Over the years, the likes of Les Binet and Mark Ritson have also joined us in our yearly brand growth event, but also we've been continuously speaking to them. And on the other side, we always talk a lot with practitioners. So over the course of the year, we interview more than 100 marketeers to really understand what challenges they face and what's important for them. And in that way, we want to also help bridge the gap between the academic world and practitioners. So for us, that's not only today, but something that we do throughout the entire year. And what I want to share today is one part of that, which is our brand growth study. So every year, and we've done this now for the 5th consecutive year, we run an online survey amongst marketeers. And that started as a relatively small survey in the Netherlands, and today has developed into what I think is one of the biggest studies amongst marketeers in Europe, where we've interviewed more than 2,000 marketeers across 11 markets and asked them anything and everything about marketing, and this year specifically about the topic of moment of truth. And we've interviewed, as you can see on the slide, people from Spain to Scandinavia and from Poland to the UK to really be able to understand the perspective of marketeers across the entirety of Europe. So that's interesting, and I want to focus today on what we learned about the moment of truth. But also, now that we've done this for the 5th year, it's also interesting for us because we can start looking at trends. It's now really seeing developments in the market. So one thing before we dive into the topic of moment truth is to see which trends do we see happening in the market. And one thing that we looked at is the sentiment. So what's the marketeer's sentiment? And a nice reflection of that is probably their own indication of increased budget of marketing share. Do they expect their marketing budget to increase or decrease over time? And as you can see, prior to the COVID pandemic, that was quite stable at around 1/3 of the marketeers expecting more budget to come. And then clearly, as COVID-19 took place, there was a steep drop in that. But since then, we have recovered. And actually, today and this year, it is at the highest level we measured so far, despite the fact that we executed the study in April when, for example, the war and all things going on were already happening. So it seems like the outlook, at least the sentiment and the expectations that marketeers have today, is a bit more positive than it was 2 years ago. So is it all good? No, definitely not. Because if we ask marketeers what's on their mind today, it is indeed no longer the pandemic. Very few mention COVID, But we do see that that has been replaced by other topics. They talk about the war, they talk about inflation and increasing prices, but they also talk about the difficulty of finding staff and people and the supply chain challenges that they face. So clearly, the external challenges and in the environment of that happened a couple of years ago with COVID have now been replaced with new obstacles that make it challenging for marketeers to be successful. And finally, when we look at trends, what I also wanted to share is what struck us as quite surprising is we looked at companies over the years, we always do that realized revenue growth, and companies that actually declined in revenue. And in green, you can see the companies that realized revenue growth, and you see that if we then focus on the question, to what extent do you feel that there is attention for marketing in the boardroom, in the organization where you work? You see that for successful companies that realize revenue growth, that has remained quite stable, despite all the external challenges of COVID and now of the inflation, etc. So always around 50-60%. But what's interesting is that if you see the companies that decrease in revenue, so the less successful companies, you see that actually that there's less attention for marketing in the boardroom, and that gap between successful and unsuccessful companies has only broadened in the last 2 years. So I think this is really clearly a call to action for marketeers to explain internally in the boardroom how important it is that marketing is on the agenda, because clearly companies that are successful maintain it on the agenda despite challenges ahead, whereas the less successful companies focus on other topics. Then shifting to the topic of today, the moment of truth. So every year we focus on a different topic. We first focused on brands, then we looked at creative, innovation, and last year we looked at data-driven decision-making. And for this year, we wanted to better understand the moment of truth. And the moment of truth is, of course, a quite well-known theme or topic in the marketing industry and in marketing literature. But if you really search for it, you see that there's different applications and different perspective on it. So it started, I think, in 2005 with P&G, who first championed the idea of a first moment and a second moment of truth, with the first moment of truth being the moment of purchase, when people decide in store what they are going to buy, and the second moment of truth actually experienced in the product. And a couple of years later, Google came on stage and said it's not just the first and the second moment of truth, but there's also a zero moment of truth when people search online. And so clearly, over time, you see that different perspectives were added. McKinsey came with consumer decision journey and the likes, and as Arne de Keizer mentioned, there's a lot of touchpoint mapping and perspective around that. So you see that it's a much talked about topic, but it's really difficult to pinpoint what it means specifically. But of course, for us to be able to study it, we had to, so we read all the literature, and we came to 3 key characteristics that define a moment of truth in our perspective. It should be a specific point in the customer journey, so a defined moment in time, and in that moment, customers form an indelible impression of the brand, the product, or the service. So it should be something where they radically change their view of the brand and ultimately also influence the purchase decision or future transactions. So those 3 characteristics for us define the moment of truth. And that's what we set out to better understand as we asked more than 2,000 marketeers across Europe to voice what they know about the moment of truth in their organization. And the first striking thing we found was actually that only half of the marketeers today are well able to articulate which moments of truth exist in their companies. So only half of the marketeers have clearly defined what the moment of truth is for their customers. And I talked to a lot of clients and advertisers and organizations, and I hear a lot of talk about more focus on the client, customer centricity, and then I think it's quite striking to see that actually, despite that ambition to think more about the perspective of the customer, only half of the marketeers is really able to indicate what the moment of truth means for them as an organization. When we say moment of truth, we also see in the data that those that have defined a moment of truth actually talk about multiple moments of truth. And I think we also saw that in the previous presentations. There typically is not one moment of truth, but successful companies mention that there's multiple moments of truth instead. If we then dive a little bit deeper into that and look at different perspectives from different job titles, we actually see that within an organization, typically the CMO is best able to define the moment of truth. About 70% of the CMOs that we interviewed are able to indicate what the moment of truth is for their organization, which is much more than for others in the organization, which is only at 48%. So you could say, well, that's a good thing, because they are the marketing leaders, so it's good that they are able to know what the moment of truth is for them. But at the same time, I think it also poses an important task ahead for CMOs to not only define the moment of truth for themselves, but also be an ambassador and a pioneer and better explaining it to the rest of the organization, to the brand managers, to the communication managers, to the product innovation managers, and maybe even to also those working outside of marketing. What else do we see if we compare companies that have and haven't defined a moment of truth? We see some clear differences in profile. What I found quite surprising myself was actually to see that B2B companies have more often defined a moment of truth than B2C companies. And I think the difference was about 65% of the B2B companies have, whereas only 45% for B2C companies. And thinking about that, it makes sense, I think, because the B2B companies that I speak to typically have better been able to define and map the customer journey for their clients because they have a more specific client base, which also helps them to then determine and pinpoint within that journey what are the specific moments of truth. But for me, it was quite surprising to see that the B2B companies actually outperform B2C companies in this area. If we then compare countries, then embarrassing as it is for me as a Dutch person, but I must admit that we see that in the Netherlands, but also in the UK, organizations have less often defined a moment of truth compared to companies in Scandinavia, Eastern Europe, and also Southern Europe. Also, we see that typically larger organizations and organizations that focus more on sales and company value as their KPI have more often defined a moment of truth. So what is it? Is it then important? We see that only half of the marketeers have defined a moment of truth. We see there are clearly differences in profile who have and who haven't. But does it matter? Is it important to define a moment of truth? And to answer that question, we looked at our data and we determined within our data set of those 2,000 marketeers, and we classified them as winners or losers. And the way that we did that was quite simple. We just said those that indicate that they have stronger revenue growth than their competitors are winners, and those that have stable or declining revenue compared to competition, we consider them the losers. It's a quite simple exercise, but it helps you to understand where the differences are. And indeed, we see that winning companies, so those that have realized revenue growth more than their competition, have more often defined their moment of truth. Actually, 20% more of the companies that we can classify as a winner have defined a moment of truth compared to the losing companies. So indeed, it is an important topic and it is an important task to do for marketeers. Of course, next to that, we also asked a whole range of questions around how do you perceive the moment of truth, what's important in a moment of truth, and we analyzed all the data and determined where do we see differences between those losing companies and the winning companies, and out of that analysis came 3 key differences in how winners perceive the moment of truth versus how losers perceive the moment of truth. What we see is that successful companies more often believe that you should focus on innovation to influence the moment of truth, and successful companies more often believe that you should focus on creativity to influence the moment of truth. So clearly you see that companies that try to to try something new, that dare to be different. Those are the ones that are successful in winning the hearts and the minds of consumers at the moment of truth compared to the losing companies. And the third aspect where we saw a clear difference was in the extent to which winning companies believed that the moment of truth is more important for them than it is for other companies. So it's not only about defining the moment of truth, but also embracing it as an important part of being able to be successful in your marketing activities. So what are those marketing activities that you should then use to be successful in the moment of truth? Again, we looked at winners and losers. And if you compare them, we see that indeed there are some differences and there are some similarities. Differences are, for example, winners more often focus on online. So companies that were successful in revenue growth more often used online advertising, social media, their website to really influence and be successful at the moment of truth. Also, we see that winners more often focus on physical availability, the point of sale material, product visibility, the distribution strategy and being available in stores. So on the one hand, it's about being visible online, and on the other hand, it's about being available in stores and physically. And I think that's going back to the original handbook of how brands grow. We talk a lot about building mental availability. And for me, it was quite interesting to here also see again how important the physical availability part of that is, especially in the light of today's challenges regarding the supply chain, of course. Next to that, we also saw some aspects where we saw no differences between winners and losers. So we don't see that companies that are successful use email marketing more often, use search engine optimization more often, or advertise offline more often to support the moment of truth. So it's not all differences that we see. It's really in the area of online visibility and in the area of physical availability. And then the final point, what we also saw when we compared winners and losers, and this touches on the topic of last year where we looked at data-driven decision-making, which we also found to be important, and that's reflected here as well. We see that companies that use data to be successful in the moment of truth are more often the winning companies compared to the less successful companies. So winning companies more often indicate that they have a lot of data available and also are more often convinced that they have the capabilities in-house to analyze that data. And really what's keeping companies from doing that is, well, the challenges that you see here. We ask people, what's keeping you from using data to be more successful in the moment of truth? And it's not that the data is not available, it's not that they don't know how to interpret the data or that there's no budget or no capabilities to do so. The main challenge is really to prioritize the data. There's so much data available today, also related to the moment of truth, which makes prioritization the key challenge to use data to be successful in the moment of truth. And also timing. So that what we found was that companies find it sometimes challenging that the data is too late and it needs to be better. And knowing that the moment of truth is a very narrowly defined moment, it needs to be quite quick in order to be impactful, to be successful. And in those areas, we actually also saw the biggest differences again between winning companies and losing companies. So where does this leave us in summary? Well, first and foremost, we saw that defining the moment of truth is actually important. It separates winners from losers. It helps companies to focus marketing activities, to focus their marketing strategy, and to really pinpoint everyone in the organization what they should do and which must-win battles exist to be successful. So how do you do that? Well, first of all, of course, it starts with just defining the moment or the moments of truth. And we see that only half of the marketers have done so. So that although it might sound like an obvious first step, there's still plenty of marketers who still have their work cut out to do this. So start with defining the moment of truth. And secondly, integrate it across your entire organization. Don't just keep it at CMO level, but make sure that everyone in marketing, but also outside of marketing, is aware what are the key moments in the journey where we need to make the difference. And how do you do that? Clearly, we see that winning companies are able to do that by being more innovative and creative than other companies. So dare to be different, think out of the box, break category codes and do something new to really stand out, because you need to realize a radical shift in how people perceive your brand. In terms of activities, we see focusing on online visibility and focusing on physical availability are key. And finally, you should always use data to validate your new and creative ideas and innovation if they are actually working and successful, so that you can continuously learn how to be successful in the moment of truth. And with that, for me, the moment of truth is almost over. And I really enjoyed sharing our key learnings with you today. And back to you, Lucas.
Yeah, thanks, Jori, for this interesting presentation and sharing the findings of our brand growth study. Your moment of truth is definitely not over, because there are some questions. One of the questions that I had, also related to the previous presentations, was that if you think about defining the moment of truth, within a lot of organizations it's not happening, as you pointed out. Arne presented his TCQ approach, but that actually is more an audit that names all the different possibilities. Would you say that there's a guideline how to go from understanding all the different moments of truth to the most key moments or most relevant ones?
If I think about how we have helped companies do that in the past, I believe it's a stepwise approach, where you first start to... The first thing, of course, you need to understand is what are the moments of truth for my customers. And that means taking the perspective of the customers. So typically what we do is we ask people to share stories of using the product, buying the product. And from those stories, we can then understand which moments of truth exist, what category entry points exist, how people come about informing their impression about the brand. And then in the second step, you need to start validating the extent, maybe in your brand tracker or in your sales analysis, which of these moments of truth are then most impactful for overall company success. And I think it's really a stepwise approach where I think the key thing is to always continuously listen to what the consumers are playing back. Because like I said before, I think the moment of truth really is a key element of being customer-focused or consumer-centric as an organization. So it all starts with listening to consumers, what for them are key things when they think about the brand and moments in their life when they formed that impression.
Okay, thanks. Another question is related to how do you actually influence that. Innovation, creativity were very important, as you pointed out, and also we saw in the different stories that a lot of technological innovations were actually presented. And one of the questions it was for Media Market was, where do you find that inspiration? And Henny explained that she asked the employees of Media Market, because they know best, but also asked consumers, and they looked for some competitors, maybe inside but also outside the industry or category they're in. So would you, if you look at the study, and I know we asked a few questions around that theme, but if you ask marketers, are there any companies or brands that do very well and are sources of inspiration, so that after this presentation everyone can look at what they do and how they approach this moment of truth? Yeah, we also asked indeed to people, to the marketeers across Europe, which companies are inspirational to you when it comes to the moment of truth. And some of the bigger brands stuck out. So IKEA, for example, is for a lot of retailers clearly an inspiration in how they continuously innovate in how you navigate through the store, for example. We read a lot of people referencing that. Amazon is also one example which is mentioned quite often because, well, it's able to really excel in all areas of the moment of truth. So both in
when you order online, but also in the delivery stage of it. I think they continuously improve themselves in terms of speed of delivery, but also how and what they can offer. And we have some local heroes. So, for example, in the Netherlands, Tony Chocoloni was mentioned, which I know is a Dutch brand, but what they did quite well, we saw some marketeers play that back, is in the chocolate bar, and in the area of chocolate, there was also category codes with relating to the color and the taste of the chocolate, and they just disregarded that and started building their own. So they have orange packaging and blue, and I think that for me was quite an interesting example of just disregarding category codes by doing something different, and then standing out from the crowd in that regard is something that everyone can look for inspiration. So yeah, that's we have plenty of examples available, and I'm happy to share those as well if people are interested in their specific category.
Yeah, and is there then one key question that will lead to the most important moment of truth?
For a specific brand, you mean?
For a specific brand? Is there one key question we say, or is that just a lot of things that comes together?
No, I think reading what marketeers say, there's no one key question, as there's also no one key moment of truth. It's more defining all the different key moments of truth, but at least classifying them as separate moments, so that you have a job to be done at each specific moment that helps successful companies, as we saw, realize revenue growth by being better at the different moments of truth.
Thanks, Jori, for again for the findings of this study and the presentation. Very clear. One of the things that I saw in one of the slides that Jori presented was that, in looking at the 5-year trend, it actually showed that if you keep a focus on marketing, that you're more successful than the companies that do not. Even during a pandemic, a key focus on marketing will definitely help a brand to be more successful.